Now, what do you mean? Oh, whoops.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Um, yeah. Oh, for a moment there, I spaced out, and I was about to say, I hope everyone had a good weekend. A little under the weather this morning. It shouldn't be too sort of impactful, but I've got some meds coursing through my veins, and so there's an extra little bit of sort of fogginess in my mind than there would be sort of otherwise. We should be okay. Today's our lecture on our last sort of substantive lecture of the semester, which is on crime and deviance. It is the area that I know the most on. Maybe this is obvious, but I mean, I'm going to spell it out, right? When you have somebody teaching, whether it's an intro to psychology or anthropology or biology or sociology, you are not an expert in the 12 different topics, or if it's a year long, 20 different topics that are covered that semester. There's everyone has a sort of a general expertise where they're able to sort of speak of every topic in a competent way, but there's areas where faculty members, instructors would have dedicated a lot more time. And this is one of those for me. Um, I've been in the area of crime and deviance since grad school. I've taught crime and deviance as a standalone course for many years. Taught courses on social control and governmentality. Um, my master's thesis was the first piece of work in that area and continues to be something I'm active in all the way to today. So all to say, of all the lectures to being just a little bit wobbled, this is one we should be able I should be able to get through. I should be able to get through and hopefully communicate some really cool ideas in an enthusiastic way over the course of the next couple of hours. I know that there was some interest in getting some statistics as it pertains to the midterm on the discussion board, and then I briefly sort of touched on that sort of on Monday at the tail end of the lecture. But I computed there were four different versions of the midterm to make it easier for TAs to locate their students. So the calculations had to be done by hand, but I have them now. Mean was 13.26, which is 66.3. The median was 13.5, which is 67.5. Standard deviations 3.24. The minimum was 0, which a handful of students received. The maximum was 20, which I think a total of 6 students received. There were 21% of A's, 24% of B's, 24% of C's, and then 17% of D's and 12% of F's. So that's the distribution of the different quintiles from A's to F. I don't have sort of a lot more to say on that right now. Of course, I'm going to talk about the link between the midterm and the final and strategies for the final in our very last class on Monday. I will say what I've said before, which is that the midterm is structured and was designed in the class to be sort of a formative assessment. What that means is that it's an assessment to learn. And the way that was done is by having it worked as little as 10% of the semester for those who are going to end up doing better on the final, which I would assume would be a chunk of students. Of course, the other components like tutorials and peer contributions and lecture reflections are trending much higher than that. I think for peer contributions, we're looking at above 90%. Tutorials are just in the high 80s. I think they're at 87 right now. And while lecture reflections are being graded holistically at the end of next week, they're also trending in the mid 80s. So the midterm is by far sort of the lowest grade, and it will be absorbed by some of these other course components. Okay, so that's a little spiel just on the front end. That said, this is a long lecture, and because it is the last topic, because the final exam has already been submitted, we got to get through the material, and then we'll have more time on Wednesday on Monday where there's not new content, there's no new readings to sort of talk about more, yeah, about learning and getting ready and all of that. So that being said, I'm going to proceed with with the start of lecture. So, question is there. Oh, thank you, Lola, for the well wishes. Victoria, do we need tutorial for today? I mean, need is I guess it's student space. You're getting five. You know, you're this. It's your five best tutorials out of six that count towards your grade. And so if you've attended all five tutorials, you know, it may be a situation where, you know, you don't, there's the level of needs not as high, but we always need to, you know, disentangle the learning from the actual grade. Oh, yes, yes, there is tutorial today. This tutorial every Wednesday. The last tutorial of the semester is today. But anyway, the question I thought I heard you ask, Victoria, is still valid. I would still encourage those of you who've attended tutorial, all five others, to go and engage in the learning. If you know you've got your 10% of tutorial grades banked already, then I guess you don't need to participate in the tutorial activity per se. Um, but yes, there is tutorial, the last one of the semester, at 11:10. Okay, so with all that said, we are talking today about crime and deviance. Um, it is not, yeah, it's a big topic within sociology, but of course, I imagine most of you are aware, it's also a topic that is around which a whole interdisciplinary programs are organized, which is criminology. Criminology, the study of crime is older than the discipline of criminology, which is relatively more recent, sort of a younger academic discipline, made up or made out of a combination, usually in most cases, of sociology, psychology, and law. Those are the three principal disciplines that have most contributed to the origins of criminology as a standalone academic discipline. And there is, because of that, a significant overlap between the study of of crime through a sociological perspective and a chunk of the work that's done within the field of criminology. It's worth noting here quickly that the most common double major for criminology is sociology. The most common double major for sociology is criminology. So there are a lot of students, a few hundreds at any given time, that are pursuing a double major in sociology and criminology. So there is here kind of quite a bit. I'm not going to get too much about sort of what are the handful of distinctions between them, but know that a lot of what's being discussed here is really sort of ends up being relevant both to the study of crime from a sociological perspective and criminology as a field. There's three big questions that I've organized the study of crime. Two questions that have dominated, both criminology and the study of crime that preceded the birth of criminology, which is why do people commit crimes and what to do about crime. Um, in some ways, these questions were taken up going back hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, there's some writing, that are even older than that. Even if the word crime is a relatively sort of more recent development, the notion of breaking laws, breaking rules that are present, and why people do that, and then what to do about that, like how to respond to people who are breaking the law, who are committing crimes. Again, for a very long time, those have been the two main questions. And so there's a lot written about those. And we're going to, engage with those today a little bit. But in the 1960s, by Taylor, Watson, and Young, three scholars within the field, they've been affectionately called kind of the new criminologists, if you're sort of interested in looking them up. But they were part of a movement. So this is, now it's 60s is a chunk of years. It's sort of 60 years ago, 60, 65 years ago. They said, before we get to the question of why people are committing crimes or what to do, how to respond to that as a society, There's a third question that's really important, and that's the question of what is or what counts as crime. It's a bit difficult to answer the question of sort of why people do what they do and why people break the law or what to do about crime without having a pre-existing sort of really good handle on what counts. And I mean, some level, that answer is pretty straightforward. What is a crime is what is against the law. But laws are not static. Laws change. What is criminal in what is considered a criminal act in some instances, in some historical period, hasn't always been the case. There's a number of things that become criminalized over time, and there's a number of things that become decriminalized over time. And then if you look across different cultures, different society, you don't have, of course, a carbon copy, similar set of laws from one spot to the other. But also beyond that, beyond the fact that what counts as crime within one jurisdiction is shifting, um, when we are talking about why is somebody, stealing food versus we're asking why is somebody engaging in graffiti on the side of a building versus we're asking why is somebody engaging in identity fraud versus we're asking why is somebody engaging in various forms of like political crimes and why somebody is assaulting someone else or killing someone else. Those are very, very different phenomenons. And while they all share in common the fact that there's a law that prohibits them, and while they all share in common the category crime, they're really very, very different sets of behaviors. And the motivations of why people engage in these behaviors, why people engage in theft or in graffiti or in identity theft or in political crime or in assault or murder, will vary quite a bit. And so, a precursor to why people commit crime is understanding better what is the range of things that fall under that category, the range of behaviors, for example, that are amalgamated under the category of crime, and understanding that category as deeply or more in a more complex way then allows us to provide better answers, to come up with better, more narrow, more accurate theories about why people do what they do. And then the responses, of course, I mean, that's always been to a certain extent integrated within the criminal justice system, what to do about crime. Again, we've got this notion of, well, we are responding to different kinds of behaviors in very different ways. The level of punishment or recrimination that takes place really, really scales up or down on the basis of what these behaviors are. So in the 2020s, in the 2026 environment, all three of these questions end up organizing the study of crime. But from an historical perspective, you had two questions that have had a longer history and one that came in a little bit more recently. So what I want to do now is sort of an exercise, and this is a good use of the chat. Again, it could be in open chat or it can be in DM. When I say crime, what is a crime? What comes to mind? Like if we're playing a word association game and you're being asked, like, what comes to mind when you think about crimes or crimes? What are the first, couple of things that come up for you? What are the things that pop into your head? Okay, theft, murder, law, more murder, breaking the law. So already we've got some specific examples and then we have some definitional pieces. What else? I think of something that breaks the law, but I think of murder first. So Elia's response sort of has both sort of pieces in place. Anything that intentionally hurts or harm. So thank you for that, Lakshmi. So we've got the notion of harm for the first time as the fifth response. Disturbing the peace from Gavin. That's really good. Um, Black and white and then gray areas. I really like that, right? The idea that I'm not gonna engage in that today, but there is this notion of what's called consensus crimes, and then which are ones where there is a really large, almost near universal agreement that something should not be happening and is bad. And then you have a whole array of sets of crimes where they're more contested categories about whether or not this thing is really should be criminalized. And in fact, people advocating for it not to be. Catherine's talking about neighborhoods and notions of safety, so that connects a little bit, but it's also it's really in fascinating ways. It's not quite the same thing as the notion of harm. Harm, like, is, has lots of definition and speaks to sort of pain. It speaks to injuries. It speaks to, like, something oftentimes that people bring to mind as like this physical component. Safety can have that, but safety is also one of those notions of, like, there's this subjective element to it. Like, am I feeling safe as I move through a neighborhood, as I move through a city, as I move through a country? Substances, yeah, Jaina. So there's lots of illegal substances that are out there. In DM, somebody says like what they think in their mind is like law enforcement, police officers. Somebody is saying handcuffs. Siddharth is talking about disrupting society. So that's really interesting. We're going to talk about that today. There's there part of the rationale that's out there, and we have these things called crime because these behaviors are problematic. Their behaviors are that are undesirable. And so they're disruptive in quote unquote negative ways. So I really like that. You don't see that too often. Someone not following the rule that were in place for everyone. Then we have assault, political. Magnolia sort of speaks to the assault was from Sky. Um, Juliana is talking about breaking and entering. Yeah, B&Es, absolutely. Illegal acts. So, a broader sort of definition. Crime are things that are considered illegal, that are part of the Canadian Criminal Code. So, Alicia, that's a really good one. When I think of crime associated with criminals, I think of serious harm rather than petty crime or shoplifting. Yeah, that's also very good, Ilya. So we think of crime. People, I could have asked a different question, which was, what do we think of when we think of criminal? And I think that's quite accurate. In fact, we have really kind of many surveys that point to the fact that when Canadians think about criminals, they're not talking about somebody who's breaking the, copyright law by downloading from an FTP site or getting their hands on a legal stream on Reddit to watch their favorite show or to watch their favorite game. That's not really what people have in mind when they think about criminals. They think about criminals as like the kinds of people that are depicted on the news, the kind of people that are depicted in fictional shows where the cops are after them and are trying to catch them. Like, you're talking about people who are doing things that have sort of this element of seriousness. So then we've got, not that not that this is the only point that I can sort of take a bit more time with, but there is something really important there that's worth unpacking. Is that crime, while it is a concept that has a clear boundary means like there's a line that you can identify of what counts as inside and what counts as outside, what belongs to crime and what doesn't belong to crime. And the reason we have that clarity is because of the Canadian Criminal Code. It outlines in great specificity what is in there. And yet, even if we start navigating and looking and investigating the things that are inside the category of crime, you do have individuals, individual Canadians, individual citizens, individual people who are making different determination about whether or not something is considered serious harm or something is more benign. So there is, and this isn't a shocking thing for me to say, but I'm going to say it out loud anyway, there's a hierarchy that gets created for most people of the kinds of laws that must be respected at all costs, like that I wouldn't even think about breaking them. And then there's another set of laws that, you know what, I can take or leave it depending on the context, because I'm making the judgment that maybe it's not that bad. Or maybe, there's a good reason for me to do this, or there's a justification, there's an explanation, there's a rationalization for why I think I can do this, even though it breaks the law. So Jane also brings up the notion of application of the law, prejudice towards certain groups. The broader category for that is kind of called selective enforcement. That's something we take up a lot when we talk about crime and deviance in a full course. Probably not going to get to engage with that quite as much today, although there will be a moment where I'll speak to that a little bit. But there's some resource allocation pieces. What that means is that law enforcement agencies, at the level of a city, at the level of a neighborhood, they have a finite amount of resources in terms of money, in terms of staffing, in terms of time. And there are decisions that are being made from those higher up all the way until the judgment and discretion from beat cops about what is worth what is more worth it, what is a higher priority, what are the things that are particularly concerning, what are the points of focus or emphasis, and which are the ones, even though it's breaking the law, even though it's an infraction, which are the kinds of things that are not quite as critical. And we know that this resource allocation is not evenly distributed. And we know from studies, including studies in the city of Toronto, that there are sometimes problematic ways in which these resource allocation decisions are being made that end up disproportionately impacting racialized groups in the city. And so that finding has been there relatively consistently and it's not to pick on the Toronto police force. That's the case in lots of places. But and it's not always a question sort of purposeful sort of intentions. But yeah, decisions are made about resource allocations. Okay, that was all very good. Thank you for that. Really kind of nice mix. So in the slides here, these are some of the things that have been brought up or in the past. And so this is by no means a comprehensive list. It's just I can't count on sometimes if students are not going to share anything or no one's going to talk, then I need to have something in there that I can put. So I'm adding a list here. Again, it's not comprehensive, but it's a list of things that people have said in the past, things like animal cruelty or moral ethical crime. There was discussion of murder. There was discussion of assault or theft, sexual assault, rape as a category of that, harassment, negligence. Sometimes people are brought up, vandalism. I brought up as an example earlier, B&E. Somebody here mentioned that. Prostitution or solicitation. Drugs were mentioned, illicit substances, arson, counterfeit, aiding and abetting, workplace discrimination, weapon offenses, espionage, terrorism, state crimes, war crimes, and then things like child pornography or pedophilia. So we've got a whole array. And so the only really kind of main takeaway from our exercise, other than all the narration I've been doing while we're doing this, is the idea that the ontology of crime, like what counts as crime, is a wide array of different phenomenons, different kinds of behaviors. And when we are going to talk about, and when we're interested in explaining why people do what they do, it's a little bit tricky to say why people commit crimes because crime is not just one thing. Crime is a umbrella term for the idea that like the law has been broken, but it really represents a very complex, very dispersed set of behaviors. And the explanation for why somebody engages in state crimes or espionage or workplace discrimination versus, theft or assault are again very, very different. So while crime is a powerful category and it gets used all the time, and crime statistics talks about crime going up or crime going down, really there's a lot of diversity within it, and so it's worth paying attention to that. So what, one of the reasons I had been drawn from my undergrad to this area, it's because in many ways I thought crime and deviance kind of really crystallizes some of the things that sociologists are interested in more broadly. Like being interested in crime and deviance is being interested in why people do what they do, right? If you're focused on crime and deviance, then why are people engaging in deviant behaviors, for example, or why people are engaging in criminal action? But fundamentally, like you're curious, you're investigating, you're trying to map out and you're trying to understand why do people do what they do. And then, those explanations apply to a bunch of things that have nothing to do with crime and deviance, but more broadly about why people what they do in broader society. When we're interested in crime and deviance, we're interested in how particular behaviors become defined over time as unwelcome or punishable. Like we are interested in figuring out in the range of everything that you and I, everybody else and all the strangers in the city and the province and the country are doing in any given day. how do we arrive at a particular set of these, a subset of these behaviors to be considered so problematic in a way that they were codified, they were put into a law? But the reverse of that is, and so the old historical way of studying crime and studying deviance is really focusing on the margins, right? You imagine society as like fully law-abiding, sort of by the book, like always follows the rules. Individuals and groups are right in the middle. And then there's groups, one circle out of that, another circle out of that, and then you get closer and closer to the margins. And finding people on the margins is finding people who have, sometimes one foot in, one foot out of committing a crime or not committing a crime, or being involved in things that are illegal versus not illegal. That's studying crime or studying deviance from focusing on the margins. But a relatively more recent approach to studying both crime and deviance, especially deviance, is to try to flip that and to say how, and certainly this is something I've emphasized over the course of the semester, the process of normalization. How are particular things understood to be like go from, being one of many to being considered sort of normal over time? How do things like that are normal in 2026 that were not considered normal in the 1980s or the 1920s or 200 years ago? What's the process by which that happens? Part of studying crime and deviance is studying normalcy, is studying like what is considered normal in a given society. And then once you have a really good handle on what is considered normal, then what falls outside of that is by definitions the things that are running afoul of sort of norms and expectations and things that are populating sort of your previously discussed sort of margins. This approach is called unpacking the center. So studying normalcy means studying norms. It means studying society's expectations. It means taking the boundaries between what is okay, what is right, what is the proper way of acting in this situation, and taking that as an object of inquiry. That means taking that as like something I'm going to study instead of taking it for granted. In a different context, when we talked about culture, what feels like, a month and a half ago, one of the things we talked about in that context is this notion of kind of culture shock, right? If you've ever had an opportunity, if you've moved from one, area of the country to another, or you've moved from one country to another, or you've traveled, you come across occasionally, a set of practices, the way people are behaving and dressing and interacting and eating and all kinds of things that are quite different. And in some cases, maybe it's shocking because it is so unique, it's so distinctive than what you're used to. And those are the moments where we are no longer taking things for granted, but we realize that what we previously took for granted was a result of the locale that we were born and raised into. It was taken for granted in our home area, where we feel most comfortable, where we've lived a chunk of our lives. But what is considered normal in one place is not necessarily what's considered normal somewhere else. And so it challenges the notion of normal as universal, the notion of normal as timeless. From a sociological perspective, the normal is always being constituted actively. That doesn't mean it's changing every Wednesday morning, and then Thursday may be a completely different thing, and then Friday may be a completely different thing. I mean, there is a hold that the notion of normal has that can last for not just months, but sometimes years or sort of decades. But even if it lasts that long, and it has a tendency to be seen as something that's always been there, it's almost never the case. Normality and what's considered normal is almost always changing from one place to the next. So today, we're talking about crime and we're talking about deviance. Those topics are taught together. Not that they're exactly the same thing, they're not. But by the end of today's lecture, and hopefully, those of you who had a chance to take a look at the textbook, that will have helped as well. It's understanding the overlap between the concept of deviance and crime, but also like the distinctive features of the two, because it's in the gaps between crime and deviance, what both of those mean, that there's some really, really interesting, really sort of interesting phenomenon that are fertile for like sociological inquiry and also gives us a really good window into the distinctive features of any given society, including Canadian society. What is the gaps between what is legal or legal versus what is normative or transgressive? Oftentimes tells us quite a bit about about the shape, about some of the features of Canadian society. If we talk about crime, as I've said a few times, it is one of those where while there's all this diversity within it, there are very clear boundaries about what is inside and outside. And frankly, unlike almost anything we've looked at over the course of the semester, health, families, education, things like media, things like culture, all of those big ideas. If you really come down to it, there isn't consensus about what the definition for those are. There is different ways of understanding these phenomenons that can be close or can be quite far from one another. That's not so much the case with crime. Like crime as a category has a specific definition. It's enshrined in the Canadian Criminal Code. It defines crime as, quote, the intentional violation of criminal law without defense or without excuse, right? There needs to be intent. It needs to be a breach of a law that's in existence, not because of the arbitrariness or sort of the mood of an individual prosecutor or judge or frankly even law enforcement officer. It needs to be something that was enshrined, that was codified. It needs to have been done sort of intentionally, and there needs to be no defense or excuse, meaning that there's a number of things that look like they violate the criminal code, but there's a defense that's offered, and the defense is compelling enough to explain why this took place. And so somebody is not found criminally sort of liable. There's a bunch of different really cool aspects to the criminal code. I'm going to move through it, relatively quickly. This isn't sort of the main point of today's lecture, but it is really interesting to think about the Canadian Criminal Code, and this doesn't apply just to the Canadian Criminal Code, but it is, it's describing the Canadian Criminal Code. It will apply broadly to a lot of other criminal codes that are out there. What this is meant to do is point to sort of pre-nation state, the way in which law was exercised, and the more sort of arbitrariness that was attached to that versus the modern criminal code, which has these features that are assigned to them. Politicality is the first feature. It means that this, again, may be quite obvious, but what is criminal is a reflection of laws that were enacted by people that were elected. So when you look at what's legal versus illegal, it's very, very much connected to the political process. It's connected to people who get elected. It's connected to what they believe should be criminal or should not be criminal. Social movements have a hand in this. Political groups have a hand in this. Lobbyists have a hand in this. They're pushing for things to become criminalized that they believe is harmful, that they believe should not be allowed, and they want laws to reflect that. And then there's other people who are pushing for certain things to become decriminalized, right? To go from the process of being something that will get you in trouble with the law to say, like, in the end, are these laws maybe reflected sensibilities from 50 years ago or 100 years ago, but now they need to change. So the very first really piece of the criminal code is that it's not this stable thing that has been, there and reliably there in the exact same way for hundreds of years. It's something that's being changed. It's something that's in movement. It's something that's shifting. Another component of the criminal code is specificity. The Canadian Criminal Code lays out exactly what is a crime and what isn't a crime. The idea of due process and what your rights are and balancing those rights and the procedures in order to establish for the system, for the criminal justice system, to establish sort of guilt. All of that is laid out. It doesn't mean that there isn't an element of interpretation. That's what lawyers are in the business of doing. That's what judges are in the business of adjudicating. But it's your every individuals in the borders of Canadian territory is able, if they would like to, although very few of them do, get their hands on the Canadian Criminal Code and see on there what is legal and what is not legal. Like it's not hidden information, private information, or selective information that only some people have access to and not others. It's something that is laid out again in great amount of specificity in a way that everyone is supposed to have access to. Uniformity is the idea that the Criminal Code is supposed to apply to everyone equally, regardless of one's background, whether that's gender or ethnic or race or religion or class. Of course, in practice, it doesn't work out, always worked out this way, but that was a very significant shift for the modern criminal code, where previously different classes of citizens or different classes of people had different laws that applied to them. And so some landowners, male landowners could do certain things that was illegal by other people to do. Or the law didn't apply to the people who were a member of the aristocracy, who were a member of the elite, as versus others. In theory, the law is supposed to apply equally to everyone. In practice, of course, we know that's not the case. We know that resources matter. We know that the ability to be able to spend on better legal representation matters. We know that human beings are involved in every step of the way, from again, law enforcement agents to, prosecutors making decisions about what cases to go forward, about judges making decisions, juries making decisions. There's human beings involved all the way through. And all of the things we've talked about all semester long about how society works, but also sometimes the gap between how, different aspects of how society work and in the beliefs that people carry with them. um, you have human beings whose beliefs, whose understanding of the world shapes the way in which they do their job. And because of you add up all these elements, in practice, uniformity is more of a principle than something that you can sort of establish. Now, you can measure that. You can measure. We have different measures in the field to say, how are we doing now compared to how we were doing, 20 or 40 years ago? What's the direction of the change? What are the things that have been put in place to try to establish more sort of uniformity? But nonetheless, that's something that's there. A really kind of vivid example of that would be, for quite a while, their decisions were made by the criminal justice system, CGS, that certain types of crimes were not seen as sort of as harmful or as serious as other types of crime. A whole host, for example, of white collar crimes were not seen as like, well, they're not violent crimes, they're not hurting people in the same kind of physical way. And so less attention was paid to those, but also the penalties that were attached to those crimes were significantly less than the penalty attached to sort of physical harm or quote, quote, street crimes and crimes that were committed by people, more committed by people who had fewer resources. There has been a small but noticeable shift in the level of law enforcement and attention and resources and penalties attached for a wide array of white collar crime and financial crimes because over time the public is come to see some of those crimes as incredibly harmful, if not physically harmful, then harmful nonetheless, harmful to their wallet, harmful to economic outcomes, harmful to their retirement plans. And so that would be one example of what we're speaking of here, the intersection between sort of resources and the law not always being applied sort of equally. And finally, penal sanctions. Judges are given some guidelines within which they can operate, but it is not an option to say somebody is engaged, a stolen an apple from a local vendor in one of the markets in Toronto, and they're going to be given 15 to 20 years. Judges don't have the discretion to do that. Like every crime comes along with it a set of sentencing guidelines or penal sanction guidelines, whether or not there should be prison or whether or not it should be, largely, probation or community service, and then how long that should last. And then the judges is supposed to use the information from the specific case to choose within that range. So I did end up spending more time on the Canadian Criminal Code than I intended to, but that's okay. It's a really interesting topic. Again, some of the areas that are, is the way in which that gets articulated and like that gets articulated in different jurisdictions, the way in which that changes, the way in which there's a gap between the aspirational or the ideal versus the in practice, and how does the idea of the Canadian Criminal Code works when it's being discussed by people who are making changes, for example, versus what is the reality of how it's being employed and the statistics that we have on the other side. Okay. Connected to this, obviously it's all connected, but connected to this is the idea that I've said, very few people actually consult the Canadian Criminal Code. In fact, it's true to say that very few Canadians are spending a great deal of time with the formal criminal justice information, including the statistics from the law enforcement agency or statistics from StatsCan. Like when we talk about crime in a Canadian context, people's perception of crime oftentimes comes from other sources. Crime has been a top concern, a top three issue concern, going almost for 50 years now. When you ask Canadians about what they're concerned with, when you have different political campaigns that are being run and parties are trying to distinguish themselves from each other, crime is oftentimes near the top. Now, very, very recently, concerns over affordability. I mean, that's not just recently, but concern over affordability or dwarfing concerns over crime as it pertains to sort of these last sort of couple of years. But crime continues to be a really sort of high points of interest for the everyday Canadian. Many Canadians believe that crime in general and violent crime specifically is at an all-time high. And they've believed this for decades, meaning that the surveys we have from these past 5 years, surveys that we have from the 2010s, the surveys we had from the early 2000s, the surveys we had from the 1990s, across that whole time span, every subsequent group, the average Canadian believes that crime is more of a problem than it was 10 or 20 years ago, that we have reached sort of a breaking point, and this is especially true sort of in the bigger cities. And yet, it's not clear that that's the case. I'm going to talk about statistics sort of in a moment. What we know is that people are consuming an inordinate amount of crime content, be it sort of the Netflix and all the cop shows on traditional networks and those streaming platforms, the fiction piece and the sort of pseudo fiction pieces were sort of documentaries about real historical figures, but which are a dramatization sort of element. There is almost like an insatiable appetite from a large cross-section of the population for crime or crime-related programming. Again, in the news, which is the sort of the age-old saying, if it bleeds, it leads, that the news is more likely to depict crime, and more than that, to depict sort of violent crime as sort of its headline news component than almost any other kind of stories that are out there. And people are consuming crime fictional kind of content in really, really large amounts. And what that means is that you may have crime statistics, which I'm about to talk about in a moment, that points to sort of a certain reality of what's taking place. And yet, the perception of crime, the perception of the issue of crime, the perception of the relative sort of dangerousness of Canadian society is more influenced by media depiction of crime than it is influenced by what police departments and law enforcement agencies are telling us is going on the ground from coast to coast to coast. So speaking of crime statistics, there's a couple of different ways that crime statistics are accumulated in Canada. Three main sources of crime statistics. What's called the UCR, previously called the CUCR, but the Canadian Uniform Crime Report. That's the information that's collected by local law enforcement agencies. Every time there's an incident, every time there's a call, every time there's coming in contact with someone where there's a complaint that was made, where somebody was processed, where somebody was given a ticket, Um, all of this is cataloged by local law enforcement agencies, and then it's accumulated and it's synthesized and it's analyzed by StatsCan. So the UCR is, in many ways, the number one place where we get our crime statistics from. And it's important to know that it's the only one that doesn't rely on samples. I'm not going to get into sort of sampling and population. That's beyond the scope of this first year class. But you're like all the other measures are based on surveys, which are you're getting a cross sample of the Kenyan population. You're speaking to 1,000 or 1,500 people that are meant to be representative of the Kenyan population, and then your data comes from that, and then you extrapolate to the whole population. The UCR is not based on that. The UCR is based on actual hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of incidents in any given year. And so it's meant to capture all of those, not from a sample size, but from a sort of a comprehensive size. The UCR, of course, doesn't capture everything, however, because there is a high degree of unreported crime. There's people who commit crimes and nobody ever finds out. Nobody ever reports them. Nobody ever complains. That might be because their crimes are quote unquote victimless, meaning no victim sort of steps forward. Or it might be because it involves an incident that somebody doesn't want to report. For example, what's called level one assaults involving a friend or a relative of the victim. Very few of those are reported. A fraction of those are reported. And then a third category of something that's widely underreported for the UCR is sexual assault. So the statistics, and this connects to something I said earlier, the statistics will also reflect where law enforcement agents are going, where they're patrolling, where they're spending time, what they're deciding to sort of intervene on and not. So the statistics reflect decisions by authorities, also the wider public, on which criminal acts to report. So the decisions that you and I might make about like, oh, this is serious enough to do something about it or it's not, and then which one to ignore. And then it reflects decisions on the enforcement side about the resource allocation piece, which I've brought up a couple of times. There is no one, um, because again of the complexity of the definitions of crime, while we talk about like crime is up or crime is down, is crime up because there's more identity theft or is crime up because there's more assault? Is crime up because there's more people engaging in copyright infraction, or is crime up because there's more theft or there's more breaking and entering? This graph here is called the CSI, not on the show, but for Crime Severity Index. It measures the relative level of severity of crime in Canada from one year to the next. It takes all the crimes that are in the Canadian Criminal Code and assigns to it a weight on the basis of on the seriousness of the crime. And this level of seriousness is based on the actual sentences that are handed down, meaning it's not like you think, you and I disagree on how serious it is. That's not what this is capturing. It's being captured by like things that have high penalties are considered more serious. Things that have moderate penalties are considered sort of moderate, and things that have relatively little or low penalties or sanctions are considered less serious. So what this graph is doing, it's giving you three bars. It's giving you crime or three lines: crime severity index, which is the total. It's giving you violent crime severity index, and it's giving you non-violent crime severity index. And what you have is a couple of interesting, and this is over a 20-year period. I mean, you can zoom out and see things over 50 or 100 years and show some really cool things. But we've got here something that is showing that's anchored on 2006, but is showing us the data over a 20-year period. And for that 20-year period, where again 2006 represents sort of 100, the peak of the crime index, of the crime severity index, is in the early 2000s. And there was a 10-year period of decline from the height of the 2003, 2004 to the 2013, 2014. And while there has been an uptick for violent crime, that you can see on the graph from the 2014 to 2021, the overall crime severity index has gone up a little bit, but has more or less sort of leveled off around where it is right now. And the nonviolent crime severity index peaked back up around sort of COVID, and then now is going back to the mid to 2010s sort of section. So what are some of the takeaways from that here? First, that if the perception is that there are more violent crimes in a 2024, 2025 than there was sort of 10 years ago, that's not an inaccurate perception. There are more. And the question about sort of 20-ish% more. Are we at an all-time high for crime or for violent crime? No, we're not at an all-time high. We the it going if we zoom out even more than that, like the height of violent crime, far higher than it was in 2006, was in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and we've been on a multi-decade downward trend sort of since then, which now is just sort of reversed in the last couple of years. When you have aggregate statistics like this, you lose some of the complexity and sort of be able to see how specific types of crimes are moving up and moving down. Of course, you can get your hands on that information. There's a lot of really sort of interesting things as you start mapping out different kinds of phenomenon. And what you will find, at least as a sociologist, one of the key things again is what are points of emphasis? And it's not that violent crime loses its emphasis. There are some changes that take place in terms of enforcement and in terms of laws that are being passed. There are some things that are sort of being moved around. A lot of the crime severity index maps onto broader economic well-being. So in times or sort of in very difficult economic times, you have a tendency to have an uptick on the crime severity index and then a downturn when things are going better, sort of economically speaking. But nonetheless, this is sort of an overall sort of snapshot of what you have. And in this is data that are populating. I don't know that I need to talk about a lot of it right here, but it's data. It's a handful of pieces of sort of data or statistics from that graph. So violent crime CSI or violent CSI rose from 93.4 in 2021, from 88 in 2020. The increase was mostly level one sexual assault, harassing and threatening behaviors, and homicide. In the following years, the CSIs continued to climb to 99.1 in 2022, 100.9 in 2023, before falling back a little bit in 2024. In contrast, the non-violent CSI since that graph, so the end of that graph in 2021, it increased to 71.3 in 22, 74 in 23, before falling back a little bit in 2024. And then the overall CSI shows a similar trend, meaning it continued to climb after 21 and 22 and 23, but then it started to decrease again in 24. That's from the latest stats that are out. We don't have all of the reliable stats for 2025 yet. That should come out actually in the next kind of couple of months. So I've already mentioned the high near 120 was the 1990s. What are the explanation for this? This is going to be my last little slide before we take our break. There's a number of factors that have been identified as playing a role. There's a lot of details into these slides, partly because it's in this particular form, it's not content that's in your text. You're not being asked about any of the specific numbers, right? It's about the trends and sort of the broader ideas. So there's demographic changes is a really big one. An aging population, especially for violent crime. Like most of the violent crime are really concentrated on young people. Usually you're talking about people 15 to 30. And as you have a smaller proportion of the population who's age 15 to 30, because the population is getting older, that's a demographic trend. That is one of the major explanations for why crime is going down, a smaller cohort of younger people. Economic factors, I've mentioned this one already, but greater employment opportunities and higher standard of living are connected to, of course, not just reduce poverty, but reduce sort of violent crime. So support systems, social programs, early childhood programs, education, mental health services, social housing, all of those have a pretty significant long-term crime prevention effect, meaning that when municipal or provincial or federal government invests in some of these programs, there is usually a pretty straightforward a impact on the crime rate in the forthcoming sort of time period. In fact, this is exactly what my own master's thesis was on, looking at the Evangeline community, which is the Francophone community in the province of PEI, and look at the investment that was made there on what's called crime prevention through social development, which is a bit of a mouthful, but what that means is that when you invest in social development and social programs, when you provide spaces for people, especially young people, to be able to spend time with, when you are investing in making sure that everyone has there's a breakfast program or as something they can eat during the course of the day, when you're providing extracurricular opportunities and when you are making mental health services more widely available, all of those things end up having a net positive impact on the crime rate. So that's called crime prevention through social development. Policing and law enforcement, I brought this up a couple of times, but there was a shift toward what's called community policing and more crime prevention strategies of sort of connecting, sort of trying to break down the barriers between law enforcement agencies and the neighborhoods and communities that they police, being more present, spending more time outside their car, spending more time out and about, so that you're not just there just to kind of catch people doing things they're not supposed to do, but there is sort of this ongoing. The community policing is the philosophy that you are around, you're present, and so when people need assistance or help, or you're a friendly face, or you're treating people as not just as human beings, but you're engaging with them on day-to-day life and not just in the moments where there's a criminal infraction or something going on. That's also been seen to have a significant crime prevention impact. Legislation and correction, stricter gun and drug laws, changes in firearm control and drug enforcement has led to decline in violent crimes. That's not an insignificant one. Some reforms, especially for repeated offenders, has meant that some repeat offenders, or what's called high risk individuals, spending more time in prison has meant fewer opportunities to engage in recidivism. Decline in certain high crime activities, so things specifically like burglary and theft, have really decreased because of the more wide available use of security technology and monitoring, and also urban planning that have been designed in a way to sort of minimize. That's crime prevention through design, through urban design. That's the installation of sort of cameras, but lighting. That's creating fewer sort of pockets or areas sort of around the city where a lot of activities could take place without sort of any easy way to sort of see it or notice it. And then other societal changes. People spending more time inside the home, people spending more time online or on devices, fewer people out there, has meant that there's been a really significant reduction in street level crimes. It has meant an increase in other kinds of crime, cybercrime, identity theft, fraud online. But to the extent that you have people on average spending less time out and about in the city, then it stands to reason, and in fact that's the case, that there are fewer crimes being committed in the streets of the city than there used to be. Okay, I said this would be the last slide, so I'm going to stick to that, even though I'm not quite at the halfway point. I'm going to have to make up a little bit of time here, but that's okay. So we're going to take a slightly shorter break than usual, just because I want to be able to get through everything. So I'm going to pause for 3 minutes, 10:08 to 10:11, knowing that everyone who listens to this later can just, pause it whenever they want. And then those of you who are here, if you need a break, you can step away and then come back and listen to the recording later. So 3 minute break, and then we're going to come back and do the second half. The 3 minute went by awfully fast. Okay, here we are. So these six factors are factors that have been found to be empirically to studies. When you've got lots of changes that are happening in different jurisdictions across Canada over a period of time, it becomes really in some ways it becomes easier to see when a new policy is introduced, when a new program is introduced, when some broader changes are at play, how over time this is correlated, and sometimes you're more than correlated, you're able to sort of show causation, how it's correlated with changes in the crime rate. So that was a set of six sociological explanation, which again, don't rely just on individual level explanation for why crime may be going up or going down. Because, right, that's the other side of the equation here. People engage in criminal activity very rarely unintentionally, although it does happen. There's a choice that's made, but that choice happens within the structure of society. And the crime rate is not just a reflection of hundreds of thousands of people made a different individually on their own, made a different set of choices, which explain why the crime rate goes up or goes down. There's the broader trends that come in and impact what those choices are. They impact the likelihood, the opportunities, like what other things are out there of whether somebody is going to engage in a crime or not. I mentioned at the top that there were three statistics, and the UCR was the main one. Of course, that's true. That's the main statistics we get from law enforcement, but it's supplemented by two other sources because law enforcement doesn't capture all of it. So the second thing that is the first that is being used to supplement the UCR is what's called self-report surveys, right? These are anonymous surveys that are used to survey the Canadian population and ask them, have you been involved in criminal activity? Have you been involved either as a perpetrator or as a victim? And what we know from these surveys is that the majority of Canadians at one point or another have broken the law. The vast majority of them have never been caught, have never been identified as a criminal, have never had any dealing with the criminal justice system, has never been labeled criminal by anyone. But they have broken the law. They have done something that is against the law and that technically they could have gone in trouble for. Whether that's you or not, I mean, obviously it's for you to know. But yes, right? Like the majority of it, it's not that majority of Canadians are engaged in B&Es, and the majority of Canadians are engaged in identity theft, and the majority of Canadians are involved in espionage. But there are laws that Canadians are judging to be less serious or less harmful. A chunk of those has to do around intellectual property rights, intellectual sort of rights. A chunk of those has to do with these illicit substances, things that at different points were illegal, but that at some point in the individual's lifetime, that could have been decades ago, that could have been this morning, this morning, they took something that they did not have a prescription for, that was at the time not considered sort of legal. About a quarter of the population reports being a victim of crime. And so that also is far more than what the UCR is showing. And again, it points to the fact that a majority of crimes out there are not actually coming to the attention of law enforcement agents. The second piece of supplementary data that's available is what's called victimization survey. And this is a specific survey that looks into the victimization side of it. This is the one that provides the most sort of detail about crime victims, but it's not as reliable about offenders. It gives us a lot of information about the experience of having been a victim in Canadian society, but it doesn't give us a ton of information or reliable information about offenders. There was no national victimization survey in Canada until 1988, but they now are being run sort of regularly. The GSS, actually, there's a GSS that's running right now. The GSS is General Social Survey, and a version of that, the GSS on Canadian safety. Previously, it was called the GSS on victimization, but it's been rebranded in 2019. The GSS on Canadian safety this purveyor of information. So that's StatScan that does this survey. They do it with a really broad cross section, so sort of Canadians. And the latest is going on right now. It's happening as we speak. So the results will start trickling in probably in the first half of 2027, where we'll get even more sort of accurate numbers. So, but what we have is the last GSS survey, which is from 2019, 6 years ago. Here's a couple of quick stats. Again, I can't spend as much time as I would have liked on these, but the stats are not the focus, so that's probably a good place to cut. But about three-quarters of Canadians were very or somewhat satisfied with their personal safety in 2019. 1 in 5 Canadians were impacted by one of the 8 crimes measured in the GSS. That means that total about 8.3 million incidents of sexual assault, robbery, physical assaults, B&Es, theft of motor vehicle, theft of household or personal property, or vandalism. So these are some of the 8 most frequently high incidence crimes, and 1 in 5 reported being impacted. 1 in 5 Canadian, 19% being impacted by that. 7 in 10 reported incidents. Almost 7 in 10 report incidents of nonviolent in nature. That's out of that group. Theft and personal property being the most common type, accounting for 37% of all criminal incidents. So of that 19%, about 7 in 10 was nonviolent in nature. So that means about 30% of them were violent, would have fall under the assault piece. Women were more likely to be violently victimized, about twice the rate of men. So the way we calculate that is per 1,000 women, so 106 versus 59. The gender difference is almost entirely accounted for by sexual assault, where there are men and women victim of sexual assault, but the ratio from women to men is about fourfold. Actually, it's fivefold, 50 to 9 per thousand. When we're controlling for individual characteristics, then women, lesbian, gay, or bisexual people and younger people are more likely to be violently victimized. And finally, the higher violent victimization rates were observed around Indigenous people, 177 incidents per thousand, particularly Métis 225 and Inuit 265. And again, that's significantly higher than it is for non-Indigenous population. Specifically, Indigenous women, there's been not enough historically attention. There has been spot moments of sort of more attentions. The topic of what's called missing and murdered Indigenous women. There's been national inquiries. There's been advocacy in many provinces. There's been advocacy at the federal level. There's been advocacy inside specific cities in Canada. And part of that is because of the 4 times more likely than non-Indigenous women to be victims of violence. In fact, Indigenous women make up 16% of all female homicide victims and 11% of missing women, even though they only make up 5% of the population. Twice as likely to be hurt by current or former partner, and more likely again to experience physical and sexual assault. 56% of Indigenous women have suffered physical assault, 46% have experienced sexual assault. These are much higher numbers. And if we talk about homicide specifically, 4 times more likely than non-Indigenous female homicides. So the specific and this it connects to the last point that's still in the chat here from Jaina about the unequal application of the law. It's not just an equal application of the law, but it's the lack of attention and engagement and seriousness with which this has been treated over the years is seen as incredibly problematic. This is some of the findings from these national inquiries that the public, broader at large, but law enforcement agencies specifically, haven't done near enough to identify what are sort of are essentially crisis level of missing and murdered Indigenous women and of violence towards Indigenous women, and that more intervention and more work needs to be done there in order to address this issue. So a few other pieces from one last set of statistics from what was called the GSS on victimization, again, renamed now GSS on Canadian safety. Childhood maltreatment, including physical and sexual abuse, witnessing violence in the home or harsh parenting or neglect have increased. I have an impact on increasing violent victimization as an adult. So there's a relationship there. This is what sometimes is called a sort of cycle of violence. In 2019, nearly 30% of Canadians indicated victimization that was reported to police. So there's a really wide array of variations in what gets reported. Half of all motor vehicle theft and B&Es and robberies are reported, but only 6% of sexual assaults are being reported. Julie is correct. Part of the issue is that law enforcement is as a hand in some of those missing and murdered Indigenous women. Those findings have been found in more than one jurisdictions, most lately in a couple of different jurisdictions out in BC. So the crimes are not all being reported to the same degree. Um, 1 in 6 victims of violent crime reported 3 or more long-term psychological consequences or PTSD. Some of the main takeaway out of all of this is that there's consequences to violent crime that can have much longer effect, both on the individual, but also when they become adult, if they witness this as a child. So there's developmental sort of significant developmental consequences on being subject to or witness to violence, domestic violence. And some of the types of crimes are much less likely to be reported than others. So why sexual assault less than some of the others? There's an array of factors that have been identified by criminologists and sociologists over the decades. Fear of retribution um, by the perpetrator, which oftentimes isn't known. Shame, guilt, and self-blame that maybe there's something they could have done that would have prevented this, and so it's carrying some guilt and blame about it. A lack of trust in the CGS because of how these kinds of cases have been treated sort of in the past. Trauma, ancestral barrier, making it difficult to sort of speak of it or not wanting to sort of relive it and reprocess it and sort of talk about it. A lack of awareness for some about what the reporting options and resources are. Um, of what threshold needs to be met. You still have a subset of the Canadian population who envision sort of sexual assault as sort of requiring, a what's called level 2 sexual assault. That's what they envision, which means that it requires sort of like a violent coercion or some other kind of violence associated with the sexual assault, as versus just the absence of consent. Stigmatization and victim blaming is still out there, and inadequate response and support. The 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 support might be there, but it's not. It doesn't feel as holistic or as supportive as one would want it to be. Or there's delays, significant delays in between the seeking out of that support and be able to obtain that support. So those are some of the explanations. It's not a full comprehensive, but some of the explanation that accounts for why this is one of the crimes that has the least amount of reporting out of the crimes that are out there. The other one that comes closest to this is level 1 assaults between friends and family members. There's a different set of explanations for that. Maybe some of that might seem obvious, but there's a lot of incidents of interpartner violence or domestic violence that are not sexual assault based, that are not reported because the victim knows the perpetrators, because it's an ongoing relationship, because there's rationalization and justification and explanations about why that took place, and there's a waving off sort of level of severity that might be there. There's sort of again another layer of sort of self-blame that's sort of part of that picture of not wanting to sort of deal with the fallout of not sort of feeling that there's options of sort of economic dependency. There's a whole array of different things that might be there. So we're back here to talk about the crime in media. The idea that the crime that's represented in the media oftentimes is overrepresented. This is content analysis of media coverage of crime, which is another fertile area of research for criminologists and sociologists and psychologists that work in this field. We know that crimes depicted in the media are overrepresented in terms of youth, even though they commit more violent crimes, they're overrepresented in terms of the coverage. Racialized Canadians overrepresented in what's being depicted. Crimes that are considered widely unacceptable are also covered more. So, in other words, the crimes you're not hearing news stories about illicit small illicit drug use or illegal streaming or other kinds of and frankly even the interpartner violence and the sort of violence acts of violence among friends or family. Those are oftentimes not the ones that are most depicted and most portrayed by media, but they're the ones who fall under this category of sort of consensus crime, where there is near universal agreement that these things are unacceptable, and there's less quote unquote elements of sort of victim blaming to those crimes than there is in some others. You're more likely to hear from the media about the kinds of crimes that lead to sort of prison punishment, and crimes that are punished by probations and fines and tickets, which are much, much more frequent. The ratio is upwards of sort of 90% of criminal incidents do not lead. I mean, frankly, it's 90% of reported crimes, so up to 98% of overall incidents, reported and unreported, but that are leading to prison as a penalty, but they're overwhelmingly overrepresented in depictions. So essentially, the focus of media in talking about crime is violent crime. Why does that matter? The reason that matters is because of what I said earlier. It's because, like, where is our source of knowledge? Where do the opinions of the public come from? And while the source of knowledge hypothetically out there is personal experience and what you're getting from friends and teachers and parents and the criminal justice system, media plays an overwhelming role in shaping how people see crime. And if you combine crime statistics that talk about overall crime, which includes, again, in greatest numbers, includes, petty theft, includes sort of the theft of personal property, the theft of motor vehicle, the theft of things like bikes. That is what makes up a lot of it, or small quantity possessions of drugs that are illegal. That makes up a huge sort of chunk of it. You hear about crime statistics going up on the one hand, but the depiction in the media of news stories is about these violent crimes. It leads, this is not speculation, it leads to typical Canadian thinking that these violent crimes are not just, 20% more than 10 years ago. They're hundreds of percent more than what they remember in their youth, than what they remember in the good old times of the 20 or 30 or 40 years ago when society was sort of like where was more put together, where children had been raised under a different set of circumstances, where people were more likely to be kind of kind, like this romanticizing of what the past looked like, as versus the contrast with I mean, hellscape is a bit strong of a term, but with like the very, very dangerous world in which we live now. That is not backed up either by the UCR or, frankly, the broader StatsCan multiple data sort of sources. And so what we know, what has been established now pretty consistently, is that the media's depiction of crime is the most influential piece on how people's perception of crime and perception of safety and perception of danger and where they live. And it's people's perception of crime that is most influential in elections and voting for particular political parties and particular candidates that are promising to address these gaps in crime and these gaps in safety. And then the policy ends up reflecting these politicians that have been elected by the people who believe that we live in the most dangerous time we've ever lived. And that is formed by the way in which sort of media shapes things. So the relative effect of the actual on the ground, what it looks like to law enforcement officers, what it looks like to StatScan and the folks who work there, who accumulate and who look things sort of more holistically and comprehensively, versus sort of the mechanism of media, public opinion, politicians, policy implementation. Um, you have a disjuncture. You have in this area, again, something you see in other areas, you see in education, you see in health, you see in other places. But it becomes, that's why it's so important for sociologists, for criminologists to be mindful of media and not dismiss it as irrelevant or as just sort of misguided, because what news and fiction and nonfiction, because it's both that have this impact, what news sort of depicts is incredibly consequential in terms of sort of policy making, um, and in terms of, again, sort of shaping how people see the world sort of around us. And then the reaction and sort of the the appetite for escalating punishment, for a series of sort of different type of intervention, for like enough is enough, things are out of control. We need to rev up how we're addressing some of these issues, when at least in many cases, not all cases, but in many cases, the data doesn't support that. So this perception of crime, this perception out there, it does vary. It's not just sort of a uniform across the population. One of the things that's been done in Canada and in the US, but I'm going to focus here on Canada, is how this is from the 2020 General Social Survey on Social Identity, not the one on victimization, this first set of stats, but 1 in 5 Black Canadian, 1 in 5 Indigenous Canadian have little or no confidence in police, which is about double the proportion for those who are neither Indigenous nor a visible minority. So about 11% of non-racialized Canadians have a little or no confidence in police, but about twice that amount. And the data from the 2019 GSS on victimization is that 1 in 3 Black Canadians, 1 in 3 more or less sort of Indigenous Canadians said that police were performing poorly in one or more aspect of their job. Again, a higher proportion than non-Indigenous, non-visible minority. What we have is a very, I mean, twice as much is not noise. What we have is different perception of the police on the basis of not just what's being depicted in the news, but on the basis of experiences in communities and experience of individuals as they navigate, for example, the city, as they navigate the province, right? Is police a dare to assist, dare to help, dare to provide support, dare to provide safety? That like they're here largely as sort of a benign presence that are contributing to my sense of peace? Or is law enforcement, or a chunk of law enforcement, is a source? This goes truthfully to sort of the post that Julie made in chat. Are police one of the sources of problems, of selective enforcement, of the way that police treats me, the way in which they accost me, the way in which I seem to be an object of suspicion more than once, more than occasionally, sort of randomly, which leading to sort of this negative perception. When you have these really large debates in Canada, in the US, within the last sort of 5 to 10 years about police violence, you have one cross section of the public who cannot fathom and cannot understand why you would have this criticism, because that is not their experience. They haven't seen, they haven't witnessed, they don't know anybody who's seen or witnessed incidents of sort of police violence. And then you have individuals and groups in other communities for whom this is a really, really critical matter. And they've got data that shows that there is, in fact, racial profiling. There is an intersection between how somebody's ethnic or racial background and the way in which they're being treated by law enforcement. Like that's a thing that's been empirically shown, including by researchers right here in the city of Toronto, both from York University, University of Toronto, and TMU, showing that this is a thing. And so it makes sense that, and I wanted to pause here, that if we're talking about perceptions of Canadians about crime or perceptions of Canadians about police, If we dig deeper, we see that there's variations within that, variations that are based on these distinctive experiences of the same law enforcement agents being understood as as most of the time helpful and there to help and there to assist and there to support, and occasionally maybe problematic because they feel like they go too far, to one's overwhelming experience is law enforcement as being part of the issue, as being repressive, as being violent. Anybody here on the call or anybody you know who is more likely to be out there active in terms of advocacy work, participating in protests, participating in marches, out there trying to get their voices heard about any topic, not just sort of police related topics, are more likely to have come in contact with law enforcement in a way where it felt like they were on the other side, that they felt like maybe they couldn't, there was fear about how law enforcement, how police would handle the folks who sort of in the crowds. And so that is a subset that's there. Janet talks about recently, saw a report in New York about the increased access to public service, less to declining crime, rather than increasing police funding, services prevent people from committing crime. And that's yeah, one, that's true. B, that yes, that's happening in New York. That is likely to happen more in New York based on sort of the recent elections that took there. But that is crime prevention to social development. That's been found to be the case over and over and over again across the whole planet. That investment in, it's not like every dollar you spent is you can trace it and map onto it that it has like a direct correlation with the decrease in crime, but the investment into specific types of social program and social services does lead to a decrease in crime. It's a very, very successful crime prevention strategy. And it's also less costly. Like preventative medicine is less costly for the state. Every dollar spent in terms of dollars saved later. Same thing goes with crime prevention. Okay. Um, I've got about 20, a little bit over 20 minutes. We caught up a little bit because I moved through some of it sort of a little bit faster, but now a lot of the focus has been on crime. I've got two more things I want to do this morning. One is to reassert what is deviance and compare to that and what's the distinction, and then flag other topics in the area of crime and deviance that, while we will not explore sort of in great detail now, are really sort of really interesting areas. Say a few things about them and then become sort of forward looking. Maybe you'll be interested in taking Social 212 crime and deviance in at some point in the future. Okay, so deviance, any behavior, belief, or condition that violates cultural norms in the society or group in which it occurs. What we're talking about when we talk about deviance is we're talking about behavior, we're talking about attitudes, and we're talking about conditions, not just observable actions. That's important because there has been an increase of folks who talk about how certain types of opinions, including political or social opinions, are stigmatized in particular contexts. It's one of those areas where people will say, depending on whether I'm around family or at work or at school or a university classroom, there's certain opinions that are not seen as welcome. That would be an example of a set of belief or a set of opinions that are considered, quote unquote, outside the norm or outside of what's seen as acceptable. And then it counts as a form of deviance. According to sociologists, deviance is relative, right? An act, an attitude becomes seen as deviance because society defines it as such, but it really changes from place to place. Um, I don't want to say this, they're hyperbole, that there's nothing more relative than deviance, but what is considered acceptable is changing all the time. It changes between generations. It changes among a close group of friends versus, being in any other kind of social settings. What you can do around your family versus what you can do, out and about, like that's not the same. Before we get into the historical, cultural, and social sort of variations. Sociologists study what type of behaviors, attitudes, and conditions are defined as deviant. We study who does this defining because there's really big part of it is sometimes these categories are contested. So who has influence, who has power to determine and to establish particular things as being deviant? How and why people commit deviant acts or come to have deviant attitudes, and how they deal with that, how they react to that, and how does society deal with people who transgress? How does it deal with people it labels or understand to be deviants? And just so we're clear, when we're talking about deviance, we're not talking about committing just sort of a criminal act. If you've ever been judged, by you've been given a look of surprise, a look of disgust, a look of sort of, incredulous look that says, what did you just say? Or what? By a coworker, by a parent, by a friend of yours. If somebody has reacted to something you're doing or something you've said, then at its most basic level, you've lived the consequences of social deviance in that moment. Like that was somebody communicating to you that what you've done or what you've said or what you were, like, or anything about what took place wasn't quite right. Now, of course, there's a huge variation between getting that look, being able to identify the few times in your life maybe where you felt this way versus this is an ongoing thing because of the style of dress you had, because of the way you speak, because of the way you look, because of some of the things you like, because of some of the, music you listen to, because of some of the people you hung out with, because of any number of things. For some, this isn't a transient thing where it's only once in a while, but it might have been their experience for a number of months, if not a number of years of feeling like an outcast, of feeling like an outsider inside what owns family, inside like that can be rough, right? Of feeling like you're the kind of black sheep of that particular sort of family is the expression of in elementary school or high school, or still if that goes on at university, at your workplace, in your friends group. Like social deviance is not just the big stuff, but social deviance at its most basic level is difference that's judged in a way that says that's not quite right. I got a couple of images here. When this exercise I've done for years, you could do it now. What comes up when you search deviance into a search engine? Actually, I haven't done it with AI just to see what it would give me. But these are some of the images from Google image search. Um, there's a few things going on here: piercings, tattoos, obviously, dye job in terms of hair, probably taken to a much further place than most people who have tattoos, or most people who dye their hair, and most people who have a piercing. So this it was on the cover of a textbook for deviance, actually. So that's an example people will have in mind when they think of that. This is on the other side of the equation. It may be one moment, unintentional moment, although this individual looked like he's making eye contact with the camera, with the camera. But a one unintentional moment, maybe somebody thought nobody else was looking, or they were careless sort of in that moment, but like caught with a finger halfway up your nose, and then usually there that elicits a reaction of one kind or another. But this is the version I want to emphasize. It's difference that sets deviance. And it's difference that doesn't necessarily have, at least objectively, quote unquote, a pejorative connotation. What I mean by that is there's no suggestion here that in an objective sense, it's better to be blue shade than to be a red shade. But in an environment where everybody else is blue and somebody is red, then it makes them stick apart. It makes them deviate from the norm. It makes them different than everyone else. And the second there is that difference that makes somebody sticks out, and then there's a reaction to that, even if it's not a reaction of anger and persecution or discrimination, although certainly that happens, then you've got an example of social deviance. Already that's at play. What we're talking about is one of the most fundamental pieces of the discussion from sociology. If we want to distill down, and I don't know how helpful that exercise is, we want to distill down sociology to a half dozen things that really are the building block of many of the other things that as a discipline we look at. Norms is near the top of that list. That's why we talked about norms when we talked about culture. That's why we talked about norms when we talked about socialization and social interaction. Well, frankly, we've talked about norms even without using always that word every single lecture of the semester, right? Norms are generally accepted ways of doing things. The everyday English word, because norm is not always the word that gets used, but it's the idea of expectation, right? Expectations to behave or to be a particular way in a given situation, in a specific situations. Norms are the building blocks of the whole society because without norms, society as we have it cannot function. Norms are there to regulate, among other things, behavior so that as you move through the city of Toronto and you are surrounded by thousands and tens of thousands and over the course of, years and years, hundreds of thousands of strangers you come across that although you don't know anything about them, you're able to move from point A to point B and engage with people and go in and out of shops and do what you need to do without like a high level of uncertainty and fear and unpredictability that would normally otherwise come from the fact that you don't know who these people are. Even though you don't know who they are and you don't know them most of the time, these strangers are behaving in ways that are expected, in ways that are predictable. Occasionally they don't, and then there's a moment you're shaken out of sort of the taken for granted, but otherwise the norms are allowing it to work. Yes, there's laws that dictate what you can't and can't do on the margins of like what are the things that are deemed as harmful or deemed as illegal acts that have been deemed to be like highly problematic, but well below that level in turn taking in conversations, in lining up in the queue for your coffee, in what's the right way to get in and out of the TTC, and that's not by like grabbing people and shoving them out of the way or like trying to climb over them to sort of ride the wave like you're in a mosh pit. In these nearly countless, and it's not countless because that's not a scientific term, but these nearly countless examples of these scripts that people are following that makes life livable around these sets of strangers that doesn't require any specific insight and unique understanding of this individual and their history. The norms are taken for granted most of the time, unless they're challenged, unless somebody violates them. And then you notice, and they're a form, I don't want to say peer pressure because that's too narrow, but they're a form akin to peer pressure. They exert a constraining pressure. That means that there's a small or a large cost in doing something that's outside of the expected, right? Walking around down the street and deciding I'm going to strip down and remove my top, or I'm going to walk barefoot in the middle of the fall down the streets of sort of Toronto. That's not technically against the law, not the stripping down, but the removing shoes, removing tops depends on circumstances. But like there's something at play. There's a little cost or a large cost that's associated with anything that deviates. Cutting in line. Okay, maybe no one says anything other than gives you like a dirty look, but maybe somebody will. There's a small cost attached to that. Expressing an opinion that none of your friends share, there's a small cost attached to that. You have a constraining pressure, and it's that pressure that leads to this regularity, that leads to what we call kind of the building blocks of society. Again, the norms vary across contexts. They're not universal in application. What's universal is there's norms at play in every context. But what the shape of these norms varies from one to the next. They change over time. They differ very strongly in how they're enforced, meaning some things are enforced with a great deal and others are not enforced as much. And so we talked about this in the early part of the semester, is the difference between like breaking a taboo versus breaking a norm that, people at the end of the day don't really care that much about. The less the reaction you get, the more it tells you this wasn't a widely held norm or an important norm. And the more the reaction is serious, It's violent, not violent as in it leads to violence, but it is like it comes hard as a reaction of disgust, of anger, of fear. It's because like there's something really big that just took place. They're transmitted through socialization. We talked at that at the beginning of the term. And so we study as sociologists, what are these norms, right? How prevalent are they? Who gets to define them? And how they, again, produce these notions of what's called proper and improper behavior, and how these norms, essentially studying norms is studying the values of society. Studying norms in at U of T, in a classroom, on campus more broadly, in a city of Toronto, in particular, workplaces, in particular families, tells us what is held, what is cherished, what is held to be important, what is held in some instances to be sacred, and then what are the things that are considered more minimal or smaller. And deviance is the other side of that. Deviance is any behavior, attitude, or state of being, conditions that finds ourselves, that lets us be outside of that. If laws are the formal written rules, right, then the norms are the informal expectations. And of course, there's a connection between them because a number of laws started as uh, norms that were held to be really important, and that the society decided it's not enough to have judgment as a consequence and informal sanctions as a consequence. We need more formal sanctions to prevent people from doing this. And so laws are codified, are a subset of codified norms. However, what happens over time is some of those crimes are passed because there's a 50 plus one majority of politicians who passed a law because there's 35, 40% of the population who voted for that party. And so a law gets on the books that doesn't have anywhere near the majority of the population believing it should be there. So it no longer represents a breaking the norm in majority term. It represents breaking the norm among a small group of people, sometimes a very small group of people. Laws are not the same thing as crime, and there's lots and lots of differences between them. So you can have an overlap. For example, crimes of violence are most often seen as both deviant and illegal, but you have elements of deviance that are not illegal. The two examples I'm providing here are things like infidelity and teen pregnancy. And despite the fact that we talked about increasingly more different kinds of intimate relationships than sort of than monogamy. Infidelity is breaching the agreed upon. Even within more open relationship or relationship with more than two people or non-monogamous relationship, there's usually a set of expectations, a set of like what's okay and not okay, and infidelity would be seen as what breaches that. It's not illegal, you can't get married. That's a whole different thing. But it's not illegal to have to love and have intimate relationships with a number of different people. But depending on the circumstances, it's definitely something that's frowned upon. If it involves breaching a trust of one of the people you're going out with. Teen pregnancy is another one that would fall under the bill. There's criminal violations that, on the other hand, are criminal but not necessarily considered deviance. The example they're providing here is things like acts of civil disobedience, people breaking a law, but breaking the law because they don't think the law is legitimate. They don't think the law should be there, or they want to use their voice, and the rules around protests and the rules about how they can do that are too constrictive or too restrictive, and so they decide to sort of break that. There's a whole host of examples in history of people who became heroes, but they weren't considered heroes. They were considered rule breakers and revolutionary in a negative way early on until, what they were advocating for became the new mainstream and then became adopted. And then after the fact, they were seen as sort of as leaders. But at the time when they did what they did, some of them were breaking the law. So the conclusion is crime and deviance overlap, but they're different dimensions. Okay, I've got what? I've got 5 minutes. That's okay. 5 minutes to sort of talk about what are the things that we didn't focus on today, but we that are really interesting parts of sort of the field, and then offering a few observations about them. So we remember started with three major questions in the field. Why do people commit crime? Which now we're expanding to why do people commit crime or commit deviance? We had the what to do about crime, which is also what to do about deviance now. And then we have the idea of, well, what is crime and what is deviance as something that we need to start with as an earlier question. And that was the focus of sort of today's lecture is talking about this piece of it. Um, so we have then, why do people commit crimes? I I would have well, let's take 2 minutes. Actually, it's worth it. Based on everything we've talked about today, what are some of the reasons people commit crimes or commit deviance? Let's take 90 seconds. And you know, some of you are able will be able to type a couple of words here or a short phrase or a sentence in 90 seconds. I am actually interested in seeing what you will come up with. Why do people commit crimes or engage in acts of deviance? So Julie says desperation. Yes, like there's something they need. There's something they really want, and they feel like they have no other options. Lack of access to important services and goods. Yes. So, right, the classical, like you have starving children and you're stealing a loaf of bread. I mean, you know, that ends up being dismissed depending on the conversation that's out there, but it is a thing. People do steal food because they're hungry. And sometimes they steal food because their children are hungry. That's a thing that happens. Greed, Ritwik says. Absolutely. Feeling of need, retaliation. You've been wrong. So, yes, taking justice in your own hands. Thank you for that, Siddharth. Lily says theft going up during the holidays. Motivator may be a family be like need narrowly defined, but you have an idea in mind of what you want for your family, and you can't get it with money, and so you feel like you're going to take some chances, and because you want to be able to give a partner or children or whatever something. Poor developmental experience, yes. Circumstances that mean that sort of decision, the socialization that meant that different decisions are being made in a different way. Childhood abuse and neglect, or being witness or victims of violence early on. We know that that's a thing that contributes. A need to fulfill one's interests, necessities. Thank you for that, Gavin. Lack of recognition of social norms. Neurodivergency, sometimes individuals. So on the deviant side, this is a really big one. Thank you, Ilya. The idea that like sometimes people will run afoul of expectations, it has nothing to do with intentional. It's because they're now reading the cues. And sometimes the so Janus also speaks to this, like the unintentional piece of like maybe unintentionally breaking the law, that also happens, but certainly in deviance, there's lots and lots and lots of evidence that this takes place. Peer pressure, desire, need for self-expression. Thank you for that, Anna and Lakshmi. So here's a non-comprehensive list. Necessity, thrill ride, feel for the rush. So the emotional piece, financial reasons, you brought that up. Out of passion, losing control, revenge, somebody brought that up as well. Self-defense, right? Fear for your life, you do something. Image, wanting to look cool. Mental illness is part of the picture. Ignorance, not somebody knowing it's illegal. Rebellion or boredom. Addiction is part of the picture. Beliefs, sometimes somebody's higher beliefs, not just religion, but it can be religion, but one's beliefs, cultural beliefs, are in conflict with the law. So then there are circumstances where that conflict of values leads to rule breaking, group membership, initiation, organized crime, hate crime, motivated by discrimination or prejudice, vigilante crime, which is the full taking justice in your own hands, power relations, because I can, because I can do it well. So some people commit crimes because that's the best way for them to earn money, more so than any other mechanisms that are out there. It's in their nature. People will brought up the environmental factor. Biology does have a role to play in this. Environmental factor is not biology, but that also plays a role. And then to create change for themselves and others, political act. So when we're talking about why people do what they do, we need to identify the kind of gestures they've done, and then we can start getting into the different explanations. In the field of criminology and sociology of crime, there's about 20, and I know it's 11, I'm going to take 30 more seconds. There's about 20 major theories that are being used to explain different slices of why people engage in deviance and crime. I'm listing some here. Some of these, many of these, in fact, were listed and discussed in your textbook. Rational choice, that it pro con list, but the pro list is stronger for committing a crime. Strain theory is the idea that like you want something, but you can't get it. So you're trying to bridge the gap. Opportunity theory is like it's right there and I'm unlikely to get caught. Association theory is who I spent time with, who I was raised by, who are my friends now. And like I'm learning that these things are not that big of a deal that I can dismiss sort of the consequences. And labeling theory is how, like especially in deviance, how other people perceive what I do, irrespective of what I'm actually doing. And that leads to the last slide, which is to talk about the way in which we respond to crime and the rehabilitation, deterrence, imprisonment, restorative justice, crime prevention, which I discussed in a couple of different contexts. These are all different responses we have as a society to people breaking rules or people breaking laws. And which one is appropriate depends entirely on what people are doing and why people are doing what they're doing. Deterrence only works with people who engage in rational choice. It doesn't work with any of the others. Rehabilitation only works under certain circumstances and others. Crime preventions I've talked about quite a bit. Restorative justice is something that comes from the indigenous populations, but have been adopted in a couple of different ways in the broader CGS. Okay, folks, this is the reflection for today. The lecture looked at how deviance is socially defined and not necessarily always inherent to the behavior. Use one example from lecture and explain how this behavior or attitude and condition becomes defined as deviant and why that can vary across contexts. Um, I will come back to this slide. All I was going to say is we have no readings for Monday. We're going to focus on the review. You have a tutorial that starts in 8 minutes. But otherwise, yes, that's all she wrote. Thank you, folks. Thank you for the contributions today. We made it through what was an extra long lectures. Have a great weekend. Cheers.
Hello, Professor.
Yeah, go ahead.
Could you just check the messages that I sent you? I just want to know before you leave.